Nobody tells you this, but the people who seem the happiest alone have usually done something most people spend their whole life avoiding. They've faced their own mind without distraction and survived it. You've seen them. Maybe you are one of them. The person who cancels plans and feels relief instead of guilt. The one who eats dinner alone and doesn't check their phone every 5 seconds, hoping someone will text back. The one who spends a Friday night in silence and somehow feels more regulated than they did at a party surrounded by 40 people. Everyone assumes something is psychologically wrong with them. Everyone assumes avoidant attachment, unresolved trauma, a wound they're hiding behind independence. But what if that's backwards? What if solitude for these people isn't a defense mechanism? What if it's the outcome of a nervous system that finally learned how to regulate itself without outsourcing that job to other people? Here's what nobody wants to admit. Most people are terrified of silence, and psychologically, that fear has a name. It's called experiential avoidance. The instinct to escape internal discomfort the second it surfaces. Silence removes every distraction, and without distraction, unprocessed emotion has nowhere left to hide. So people fill the gap. They fill it with parties they don't enjoy, conversations that never go anywhere, relationships that drain more than they restore. They call it connection. Psychologically, it's often just avoidance, dressed up as socializing. The people who love solitude figured something out, usually the hard way. Social psychologists call it impression management, the constant, exhausting work of monitoring how you're perceived, softening opinions, performing agreeableness to avoid friction. Most people do this so automatically they don't even notice the cost. But at some point, for certain people, the cost becomes unbearable. The performance collapses. And in that collapse, they discover something most people never do. That solitude isn't the absence of connection. It's the presence of self, without a managed performance running underneath it. But here's where it gets deeper, because loving solitude rarely starts peacefully. For most people who end up this way, it starts with rupture. What attachment theory calls a break in relational trust. A friendship that ended without explanation. Years spent performing a version of themselves until their actual voice went quiet. A room full of people who said they cared, but never once asked how they were really doing. And in that forced loneliness, something breaks. But in psychology, what breaks doesn't always stay broken. It often reorganizes into something called post-traumatic growth. A documented phenomenon where rupture leads not to permanent damage, but to a stronger, more self-referential sense of identity. Once you survive being unseen by the people who are supposed to know you, something in you stops requiring external validation to know you're okay. You start building what therapists call a secure internal attachment, a relationship with yourself that doesn't collapse when nobody's watching.
Let's talk about what's actually happening neurologically, because it's not what most people assume.
Social interaction, especially in groups, activates constant cognitive monitoring, reading micro-expressions, predicting reactions, adjusting tone in real time. Researchers call this social cognitive load, and it activates the same threat detection systems used for physical danger, just at a lower intensity for longer periods. For people high in trait sensitivity or introspection, that load accumulates fast. Alone time isn't indulgence for them. It's parasympathetic recovery, the nervous system finally downshifting out of low-grade vigilance. But there's something deeper still, something almost nobody names correctly. People who've made peace with solitude usually aren't avoiding their thoughts. They're doing something psychologists call emotional processing in a low-stimulation state. Sitting with a feeling long enough for the amygdala's alarm to quiet down without a distraction, hijacking it first. Most people scroll the instant silence appears, because silence is when suppressed material surfaces. Fear of irrelevance, fear of not being enough, grief that was never metabolized. But the people who face those thoughts alone, repeatedly, without rescue, build something called distress tolerance. Once you've sat with the worst thing your mind can produce and survived it, silence stops being a threat. It becomes, psychologically, a safe base. This is the part that surprises people most. The individuals who appear the most emotionally self-sufficient are frequently the ones who once needed people the most and were failed by them. Their independence isn't the absence of attachment need. In attachment terms, it's often earned security, a nervous system that learned, sometimes through pain, to self-soothe because no one else reliably would. That's not something to pity. That's one of the most adaptive transformations a human mind can undergo. Watch how these people carry themselves. There's a behavioral marker psychologists associate with internal locus of control. They don't rush to fill silence in conversation, don't spiral when plans get canceled, don't monitor their phone for proof they matter. That stillness isn't coldness. It's what happens when someone's self-worth stops being externally regulated. And counterintuitively, this is when relationships actually improve. Because people are no longer selecting connection out of fear of abandonment. They're selecting it from what self-determination theory calls autonomous motivation. Wanting someone there, not needing them there to feel whole. The less you need people, the more authentic your connection to them becomes.
Because it's finally built on choice rather than deficiency.
There's a reason this resonates so deeply with people who've always felt slightly outside the group. Because society treats low sociability as pathology, a red flag, a symptom, evidence of something unresolved. But that framing ignores a basic principle in psychology. Regulation looks different, depending on what a person's nervous system had to survive. What if solitude isn't a symptom of brokenness, but evidence of a self-concept stable enough that it no longer requires a room full of witnesses to feel real? Here's the final piece, the one that reframes everything. People who love being alone aren't withdrawing from life. They're engaging with it through a different psychological mechanism, what researchers call self-concordance, living in alignment with an internally defined self rather than an externally performed one. Every hour spent alone is an hour not spent maintaining a performance they don't believe in. Every quiet dinner is one where attention isn't split managing someone else's experience of them. And at some point, without announcing it, they arrive at something most people spend a lifetime chasing externally, a form of psychological safety that doesn't depend on anyone else showing up. So if you've ever felt guilty for preferring your own company, understand what the psychology actually says. You're not avoidant, you're not broken. You've built an internal attachment figure most people never develop. Yourself, fully regulated without an audience. If this explains something about yourself you never had language for, don't scroll past it in silence. Subscribe, because there's more of this coming. The psychology behind the things nobody says out loud. Comment below, honestly. Are you someone who's built that internal security, or are you still building it? Either way, you're not alone in this, even when you're alone. That's the whole point.